Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Bava Metzia. We are up to Perek Chet Mishna Gimel. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Ranbai, Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Chana bat Miriam, Sason ben Ryan, Yoshua ben Shifra, Menuchatam Began Eden, Amen. And Lavdi ben Chaim Lechaim, V'derefua Shelemav, Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, B'tor Shach Olei Israel, and Dachlama Merav ben Amin, O Tzion Chai ben Dvorah. A borrower becomes responsible for the item he borrows as soon as he takes it from the lender. Mishnah Gimel explains when he becomes responsible in cases where he does not take the item directly from the lender, but has it sent to him. The Mishnah begins by listing 6 cases in which the lender chooses the person to bring a cow to the borrower and then teaches the law for these 6 cases. Hashoel et hapara, if someone arranged to borrow a cow, v'shilecha lo biyad beno, biyad avdo, biyad shlucho, and the lender sent it to him in the hands of the lender's son, or in the hands of his servant, or in the hands of his messenger, or biyad beno, biyad avdo, biyad shlucho shel shoel, or he sent it to him in the hands of the borrower's son, or in the hands of his servant, or in the hands of his messenger. Now the Mishnah does not mean that the borrower told the lender to send the cow with his messenger. He merely sent this messenger to the lender to arrange to get the cow. He thereby indicated to the lender that he considered this person trustworthy, but did not actually instruct the lender to give it to him. So if the lender sent the cow with him, if the lender sent the cow with him, he is considered the lender's agent, not the borrower's. Vameta, and the cow died on the way before reaching the borrower. Patur, the borrower is exempt. Since in these cases the lender chose the person to bring the cow, that person is considered to be acting on the behalf of the lender, and the cow is therefore still in his possession. The borrower is not responsible for the cow until it actually reaches him. The Mishnah now lists 6 cases in which the borrower chooses the person to bring the cow, and another 6 cases in which, although the lender chose the person, the borrower agreed to have it sent through him. Amar lo HaShoel, however, if the borrower said to the lender, Shalchali biyad beni, biyad avdi, biyad shluchi, send the cow to me in the hands of my son, or in the hands of my servant, or in the hands of my messenger, O biyad bincha, biyad avdecha, biyad shluchacha, O biyad bincha, biyad avdecha, biyad shluchacha, or he said, send it to me in the hands of your son, or in the hands of your servant, or in the hands of your messenger. In other words, the borrower chose the person to bring the cow to him. The commentators explain he told the lender to send it with the lender's Hebrew servant, Eved Ivri, since a Hebrew servant is not actually the property of his master, merely someone who is required to work for him a certain amount of time, he can become the agent of the borrower. However, if the lender sends it with his Canaanite slave, even if the borrower told him to do so, the cow is still considered to be in the lender's possession because the Canaanite slave is the property of his master. So as long as the cow is in the slave's hands, it has not left the lender's possession, and the borrower is not responsible for it until it reaches him. So this case is referring to his Eved Ivri, his Hebrew servant. Or shamar lo hamashil, or even if the lender said to the borrower, Arini mishalecha lecha biyad beni, biyad avdi, biyad shluchi, I am sending it to you in the hands of my son, or in the hands of my servant, or in the hands of my messenger, or biyad bincha, biyad avdecha, biyad shluchacha, or he said, I'm sending it in the hands of your son, or in the hands of your servant, or in the hands of your messenger. V'amar lo hashoel shalach, and the borrower said, send it, by telling the lender to send it with this person, as if he told the lender, appoint this person to bring the cow on my behalf. V'shilecha v'meta, and he then sent it, and the cow died on the way before it reached the borrower. Chayav, the borrower is obligated to pay for the cow. In all of these cases, the one bringing the cow is acting on behalf of the borrower. The cow is already considered to be in the borrower's hands, and he is therefore responsible for it. Now, having taught when a borrower's obligation starts, the Mishnah teaches when it ends. V'chen b'shasha machazira, and so too when the borrower returns the cow. If the borrower sends back the cow with someone he chooses, he is still responsible for it until it reaches the lender. Therefore, if it dies on the way, he must pay for it. However, if the cow was borrowed for only a certain number of days, the borrower pays for it only if it dies during those days. Once they are over and he cannot use the cow anymore, he is no longer a borrower, and his status is merely that of an ordinary shomer, since he must still take care of the cow until it is returned. Even a paid shomer is not responsible for damage beyond his control. So if the animal dies before it is returned, he does not pay for it. But again, in our case, it's during the certain number of days that he borrowed it. He is obligated until it reaches the lender. If the lender tells him to send it back with a certain person, that person is acting on behalf of the lender. Therefore, if it dies on the way, the borrower does not have to pay since it has already been returned to the lender. And that is in a Mishnah Gimel. In Mishnah 2, we learned about a dispute between a borrower and a lender, which centered on the question of a cow's status at the time it died. Mishnah Daled now teaches about a dispute between a buyer and a seller, which arises from a question about the item's status at the time of the transaction. Hamachalif para b'chamor v'yalda. If someone trades a cow for a donkey, and after making the trade it is discovered that the cow had given birth, when two people agree to trade their belongings, as soon as one of them makes a kinyan on the item he is getting, the other one acquires the other item in the trade, even if it is in a different place. This type of transaction is known as chalifin. In our case, the owners of the cow and donkey agreed to trade animals. The owner of the cow pulled the donkey into his possession, thereby making a kinyan in it, mishicha. As a result, the cow automatically became the property of the other person, the one who originally owned the donkey. The cow itself was not present. When the new owner came to take the cow, it was discovered that it had given birth. And we do not know whether it gave birth before the trade took place, in which case the calf belongs to the first owner of the cow, or whether it gave birth after the trade took place, in which case it belongs to the new owner of the cow. If the cow was still pregnant when it was traded, the unborn calf was included in the trade. The reason the Mishnah does not discuss this in regard to a cow that was sold in an ordinary matter is that a cow must usually be present when it is sold in order for the kinyan to be effective. It would then be obvious whether it gave birth before the transaction or afterward. The Mishnah therefore speaks of a case where the cow was traded and therefore did not need to be present at the place of the transaction. And so too if someone sells his Canaanite slave woman and after selling her it was discovered that she had given birth, a Canaanite slave can be acquired simply by paying money to his or her owner, as it says in Kiddushin chapter 1 Mishnah 3. Therefore she herself did not have to be present at the sale. Later they find out that she had given birth, and we do not know whether she gave birth before the sale, in which case the child belongs to the first owner, or whether she gave birth after the sale, in which case the child belongs to the new owner. In both of these cases, if the seller says she gave birth before I sold her, so the offspring belongs to me, and the buyer says she gave birth after I bought her, so the offspring belongs to me, they divide the value of the calf or child. This Mishnah also follows the opinion of Sumchus. The sages, however, hold that if one of them has the calf in his possession, he keeps it unless the other one can prove when the calf was born. If neither one has it in his possession, such as if the cow gave birth on public land and the calf is still there, the calf belongs to the original owner. As the Gemara says on page 100 in Bava Metzia, the Rav tells us that halakha does not follow Simchus, the halakha follows the opinion of the sages. The Mishnah now teaches about another disagreement between a buyer and a seller. In this case, the law depends on the claims of the two people. The Mishnah first presents the cases of the dispute and discusses the law for them. Someone had two slaves, one large and one small, and he sold one of them, but he and the buyer disagree about which slave was sold. And so too, if someone had two fields, one large and one small, and he sold one of them, but he and the buyer disagree about which field he sold. The law in these cases depends on their claims. The Mishnah lists 4 sets of claims and the law in each case. The first set of claims, if the buyer says, I definitely bought the large slave or field, and the other one, the seller, says, I do not know which one I sold you, the buyer has the right to the large one. Since the seller would have to swear an oath in this case to free himself from giving the buyer what he claims, and he cannot swear since he admits he does not know, he must pay the claim. Like we explained in Mishnah 2, one cannot force someone to pay based only on a claim. Therefore, the fact that the buyer is sure and the seller is unsure is not enough reason to force the seller to give in to the larger claim. However, since the seller agrees that he did sell a slave or field, he is admitting to part of the buyer's claim. Therefore, to be free from paying the full claim, he must swear the oath of a modeh b'miktzat, one who admits to part of a claim, that he does not owe everything the buyer claims. Since he cannot do so because he admits he does not know, he must pay the full claim. The second set of claims, the mocher omer katan machalti, if the seller says, I definitely sold you the small slave or field, v'ala omer ani yodeh, and the other one, the buyer says, I do not know which one you sold me, eno ela katan, the buyer has the right only to the small one. The seller is not obligated to swear in this case because the buyer is not making a definite claim. Although the seller agrees that he owes something, he does not have to swear in this case that he does not owe the larger amount because the buyer is not certain that the seller owes the larger amount. The third set of claims, Zeomer Gadol, if the buyer says, I definitely bought the large slave or field of Zeomer Katan, and the seller says, I definitely sold you the small one, Yishava Mocher Shakatan Machal, the seller must swear that he sold him the small one and the buyer receives only the small one. Since the seller agrees that he did sell a slave or field, he admits that he owes something, therefore he must swear that he does not owe everything the buyer claims. Since in this claim the seller is sure of his claim, he can swear the oath and be free from paying the larger amount. The fourth set of claims, Zeomer en yodeh, the buyer says, I do not know which one I bought. V'zeomer en yodeh, and the seller says, I do not know which one I sold you. Yachaloku, they divide the difference in value between the large one and the small one. The seller gives the buyer half the extra value, and the buyer loses the other half. This again follows the view of Sumchus. Sumchus again, he says you divide the difference in value between in this case, between the larger one and the small one. The seller gives the buyer half the extra value, and the buyer loses the other half. The sages, however, say that the buyer gets only the small field or slave. Since the fields or slaves are in the seller's possession, the buyer must prove his claim is correct. The Gemara notes that the Mishnah cannot be speaking of cases where the buyer is actually demanding the larger slave or field, because a person cannot be forced to swear about land or slaves, as it says in Shavuot chapter 6, Mishnah 5. Also, admitting to having sold the smaller one would not technically be considered admitting to part of the claim, because the small slave or field is not part of the large one being claimed by the buyer. Instead, we must explain this set of cases of the Mishnah as follows. A person, the buyer, gave money to someone else, the seller, and asked him to use the money to buy a slave or field for him. So the seller in this case is not actually the person selling the slave or field, but a broker arranging the sale to the buyer. In the end, however, the seller was not able to arrange the sale, and the buyer now wants his money back. The buyer says, I gave you enough money to buy a large field or slave, which you should now return. But the seller says, I do not remember if you gave me that much money. You might have given me only enough for a small slave or field. Since they are arguing about money, not about a slave or field, and the seller admits he owes part of the amount being claimed, he must swear that he was not given enough money to buy a large field or slave. Since he cannot do so, he must pay. And the other three sets of claims also can be explained as referring to a dispute over money. This is how the Rav explains it based on the Gemara on page 100a in Masechet Bava Metzia. That is an Abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.